And welcome back. This is ballerscuba with more bonus episodes of Let's Play Ys, the Oath in Felghana. When we last left off, I went through the normal boss rush on the Steam version of the game, and I didn't get the reward that I was anticipating, which was another fight. I did more research into the subject, and I still can't figure it out fully, but I can tell you what I have learned. The main problem is that I need to do it on nightmare mode. Whether I am allowed to die while I am going through the nightmare boss rush seems to be up for debate. Based on what I can find, though, many people do mention getting through it while dying, but there's a lot of information out there that says if you want the, final extra boss that I was looking for, you have to do it without dying. There's a lot of people that say that, but there's a lot of people that say they got it without that as well. So my assumption is to say that you are allowed to die, but I could be wrong on that one. I am definitely not good enough to test it out myself without save states, and I don't have those in the Steam version of the game. So we are going to move on to the PSP version of the game and try to talk about some of the differences in these two titles. Even though it is the same game, when they ported it from the PSP to the Steam version to computers, they changed quite a bit. One of the things that I did notice is that there are indeed voice actors in this version. There are no voice actors in the Steam version. I couldn't get them to show up, but we do have time attack here. We'll go over that. I have found a save game for the PSP version, so I don't have to beat the entirety of the game again. There's clearly cheats in use for this save, so we'll see what I can find. But before we get into that, let's head to the museum. This is available from the beginning of the game, but it populates as you progress through the game. Since we have already completed the game in this save file that I downloaded, let's take a look at what is available in the museum in the PSP version of the game. We have the prologue, we have the gallery, and then we have movies. We'll start with the prologue. It's a novella. That's usually means a lot more words than I'm willing to talk about here, but it is shorter than a proper novella. Let's go ahead and peruse it. Let's see a little bit more about what happened before we got to Felghana with Adol. And I haven't heard them say Doji yet, but I have heard them say Adol and not Adol. So I've been saying it wrong for 3 games now. Let's head in and see what we can find here. Do you know the name Adol Kristen? Ah, Adol Kristen. He was a swordsman and adventurer, born over 1,000 years ago in a small mountain village in northeastern Europe. From his boyhood days to his final years, he surrendered each and every moment of his life to fate, always looking for a new adventure. Tales of his exploits can be found in the histories of almost every world culture, though interpretations do vary quite wildly. For every record that identifies him as a just and virtuous hero, there is another that brands him as an emissary of chaos and disorder. Were these divergent accounts the only references available, it would be most difficult to paint an accurate picture of the man. Fortunately, there are other, far more reliable sources of information on the life and times of Adol Kristen. I speak, of course, of his own personal travelogues, which number well over 100. His many adventures have been meticulously chronicled therein, thoroughly detailing every person, place, and event of note. These are not tall tales, but factual accounts. Each volume is comprised of a simple, honest narrative with an emotional detachment that welcomes personal interpretation. Yet despite Adol's dry and humble candor, all who read of these brave new worlds come away from the experience deeply affected. Indeed, 'tis as if the reader is right there with him, feeling just as he must have felt. The events I shall now recount took place a mere 3 years after Adol Kristen set out on his first adventure. Collectively, these accounts are regarded by scholars as the Felghana archives. I invite you to take up Adol's sword as if it were your own and allow yourself to become immersed within his words. There we get a nice little picture. Our story begins with two travelers standing atop a hill overlooking the ocean. As they stood, the breeze from Siena Bay washed over them, bringing with it the salty scents of the sea. These sights and sounds and smells all mixed together to create a sense of wonderment, reinvigorating their travel-wearied hearts. The younger of the two men stood transfixed, staring at the beautiful scenery in front of him. His eyes glinted with vigor and promise. The wind tousled his hair and pulled at his clothes like an eager pet greeting its master. One could scarcely be certain which was brighter, the sun in the sky or the fiery red locks of a man longing for new frontiers. Needless to say, this was Adol Christen, whose name was already widely renowned from his prior adventures. At the time of our tale, Adol was 19 years old, placing him on the very cusp of boyhood and manhood. His traveling companion was notably older in appearance. He was a buff, burly man with impossible muscles, around the age of 24 or 25. This was, of course, the former thief, Doji. Adol's life was once saved by Doji, and the two of them became inseparable ever since. They were like kindred spirits and had journeyed together for around 2 years at this point. One might call them wanderers, for they would go anywhere together on the slightest whim just to see what destiny had in store. Until a certain chance encounter, however, neither of them had ever even considered returning to Doji's homeland. "Look over there in the distance. You can see Felghana from here," Doji exclaimed. He was pointing past the shore over the ocean. Adol fixed his eyes on the horizon, where he saw a vague outline of Doji's birthplace. It seemed far, but still well within reach. Their goal was set 3 months prior, when a caravan of traveling merchants visited the town they happened to be passing through. This particular caravan had coincidentally crossed Adol and Doji's path numerous times, drawing quite a crowd on every occasion. As soon as they'd unload and set up shop, throngs of people would rush in to buy their exotic goods and hear tales of foreign lands. On that fateful day, Adol and Doji were among the throngs, hoping to learn all they could from the worldliest visitors around. Sadly, the merchants had already been talking with eager townsfolk for hours and seemed to have tired of endlessly telling their tales. With masses of curious onlookers nipping at their heels, they began making sour faces and complaining loudly of their ill fortunes. "We need to rest, my friends. Before this, we passed through a land called Felghana, where we worked hard but sold nothing." Perhaps feeling guilty at besmirching the name, they continued, addressing the tribulations being faced by the Felghanan people. Apparently, through strange weather and afflictions of unknown cause, production of crops had reached an all-time low. As a result, the cost of living had increased exorbitantly, making the basic necessities of life much harder to come by. "Seemed true enough to us," interjected one of the merchants. "All the plants in the fields had an unhealthy yellowish hue. But the peculiar thing is, the trees in the nearby woods were all green and vibrant." Something was clearly amiss, but certainly under such conditions, who can blame them for not buying our wares? We quickly set out for greener pastures, quite literally in fact. And here we are, albeit weary from the ordeal. As the merchants recovered from their bout of indiscretion, they moved on to another topic, but Doji did not. He was clearly perturbed. Adol did not notice this change in Doji's countenance, however. He had become wholly preoccupied by the merchants' further tales. It wasn't until later that night that Doji finally spoke up. He revealed to Adol that he had been born and raised in Felghana, in a small town called Redmont. And after leaving Redmont to see the world 8 years prior, he had never once returned to visit. "I kept meaning to," he said, "but I just never got around to it. And now it sounds like they're really in trouble. Adol put a finger to Doji's lips, cutting him off mid-sentence. No more needed to be said. Without a word, Adol nodded his consent. Doji's expression brightened instantly. In that moment, their next destination had become clear. The following morning, they were to set out on a long journey to the town of Redmont in the land of Felghana. As the two of them made their way across Europe, Doji recounted tales of his boyhood, painting an image for Adol to envision. We've been to a lot of different towns, and some have really been gorgeous, but Redmont trumps them all. The streets are filled with a warmth and energy unlike any place else in the world, and the local fruits and crafts are the best. The people, too, are about the nicest you'll ever find. They'd give you the shirts off their back if you needed them. I was actually orphaned at a young age, so the whole town basically raised me, and I never once felt lonely or anything. I always helped out at the inn, and the owner there was kind of like my mother. She really looked out for me. I was a bit of a menace, though. Not too surprising, huh? I'd always go out and cause trouble and drag all my friends into it. It's all coming back to me. The blacksmith, Adonis, the shopkeeper, Cynthia, and the Stoddart children at the mayor's house. Man, they were little brats like me when I left. Hard to imagine them all grown up. I'll have to make sure I stop in and say hi. After a brief pause, Doji added one last comment. You know, looking back, I'm really lucky to know all the people I know. You included, Adol. Adol felt the same way and nodded his response to Doji's compliment. A modest smile stretched across his face. The two of them stared at Siena Bay for just a short while before walking down the hill toward the harbor. The road into the port town was well maintained, clearly intended for tourism and trade, but it was also strangely empty. As noontime approached, a small group of horse-drawn covered wagons crossed their path, breaking the day's calming silence. Each wagon was decorated with flags, and the passengers were adorned in unusually colorful garments. For Adol and Doji, this was a dead giveaway that they'd encountered a gypsy caravan of fortune-tellers, acrobats, and such. These were nomadic people who had no home outside their own coaches and were most renowned for their highly accurate divination. Doji called out to one of the drivers, and slowly, the caravan came to a halt. He asked them if they knew of the troubles in Felghana, and they were indeed aware of the rumors. But sadly, they knew no more than what the traveling merchants had previously revealed. After conversing with them for a short while longer, Doji suddenly had an idea. He looked over at Adol. Hey, Adol, what say we get our fortune told? Maybe we can find out what's causing all the problems in Felghana that way. Adol nodded his approval, and Doji paid the fortune teller. And there she is. She was a beautiful young woman with smooth, glossy black hair that tumbled all the way to the small of her back. Without a word, she took a table from the back of her coach, placed it along the roadside, and centered a crystal ball upon it. She then laid her hands on the ball and stared intently into its depths. And in no time at all, it became clear that the fortune teller had borne witness to something most unholy therein. As Adol, Doji, and the other gypsies watched, her face gradually drained of color, and her eyes widened with panic. Then small cracks began appearing along the crystal surface, and all at once it shattered out into innumerable shards as if detonated from within. The fortune teller staggered back from the impact, looking like someone had punched her in the face, and then she collapsed into a heap upon the ground. Instantly, the other gypsies rushed to her aid, administering to her wounds. It took little time for her to regain consciousness. But even back in the safety of the caravan, far from danger, she would not say one word about the horrors she had witnessed. Each time the subject was broached, her face would contort into an expression of pure, uncontrollable, almost primal terror. She would not even speak of other topics. She simply said nothing at all for several minutes. Then she gestured for one of the acrobats to come over and whispered a few words to him. Although loud enough for Adol and Doji to hear, it was not their language she spoke. The acrobat nodded and approached Doji. Whatever the fortune teller had seen, it could not be put into words, lest it bring forth a cataclysm beyond imagining, he said. All he could add to this explanation was that Adal and Doji should stay out of Felghana, and he quite vehemently stressed this point. But to this, Adal would not nod his consent. He had known from the start that this was no mere vacation, and had no intention of abandoning his journey out of fear alone. Doji was of the same mind, and firmly shook his head. The acrobat sighed, knowing he could no more convince these two to stay behind than convince a mountain to stroll away. He returned their money, then joined the rest of the caravan in bowing a polite farewell. The group then made an overly hasty retreat. Shortly thereafter, Adal and Doji arrived at the nearby port town, where they stayed the night to recuperate from this unpleasantness. The next morning, they chartered a small boat and set off, never looking back, and before long, their destination had come into view. "Look, Adal," exclaimed Doji. "There it is, Felghana, the land where I grew up. We're getting really close now." The sun was hidden behind a mountain range far in the distance, dyeing the earth and sky alike an eerie shade of crimson. Still, Adal could see the land growing ever nearer. As he stared, he couldn't help but think of that poor fortune teller. Doji, on the other hand, had a wide-eyed, childlike expression on his face. "It's as beautiful as I remember," he said glowingly. Adal simply nodded in silence, never once turning his gaze from the ever-encroaching mass of twilight-hued land before him. It was certainly beautiful, but there was something else about it as well. Adal had a premonition of sorts. Not all at once, mind you. It was more of a slow realization, dawning on him bit by bit as the boat carried them closer and closer. It felt as if something sinister awaited them in Felghana, and the more Adal stared, the more threatening this new frontier seemed. "Almost there. Just another hop, skip, and a jump, Adal." As Doji spoke these words, he began rowing the boat more furiously. It almost seemed to Adal that he was giving chase to his boyhood. Adal shook off his misgivings and forced his arm to row in time with Doji's enthusiasm, and soon the boat was ashore. It is only at this point that the adventure truly began. And that's the prologue. I mean, it's rather long, but at the end of the day, I really do wish that they moved that forward to the Steam version of the game. I feel like it does provide a little bit of an insight into their mindset going into it. Granted, it doesn't change much for the story other than a fortune teller said something terrible would happen should we go over there. I feel like something bad would have happened if we didn't anyway, but maybe that's just me.